Can you all see the slides?
Not yet.
You can't.
There we go. Now we can see it. Yes.
Al,
Excellent.
Jeremy, can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah,
Okay.
you're
And
on.
somebody else is there named TKS.
Is that TK? Is that you, TK?
Hello, TK. Earth to TK, come in.
Uh-oh. Maybe he's just listening.
Now, Al went away.
Uh-oh.
Oh,
Al, was it something I said?
no, I'm still here. The video just went away. I'm still here.
All
Okay.
right.
Okay.
We're going to look at today the executive power, that is the power of the President of the United States. And the power comes from basically the US Constitution. We're going to talk a little bit about how it got there. And of course, what I'm going to be mentioning is why should anybody in IEEE care about this, right? We'll get to it, I promise.
This is TK. I'm sorry, I couldn't unmute easily. I apologize.
Oh,
I'm
hi,
here.
TK.
Okay.
Welcome. Welcome.
You could turn on your camera if you want, TK. You can't be any uglier than I am, so. All right, so why should the presidential power matter to IEEE? First, I looked at the funding that IEEE gets. All right, one of the things that happens is your tax return is on the internet. And I took a look at the 2023 tax return. IEEE has three sources of funding, which depend in part directly or indirectly on the whims of the president. Grants, investment income, and dues that are paid by government and university employees. There's also the cost of equipment and supplies that are dependent on things like tariffs and what the president does to affect the supply of goods and services. And then there are all the regulatory agencies. Now, there are two types of regulatory agencies. They're the ones set up by Congress and under the control of Congress. But most of the regulatory agencies you're familiar with, take the FCC, for example, which affects about everything IEEE does in the United States. They are an executive agency. That means they serve at the whim of the president. So their officers there are rules about who can be the director of the FCC and assistant directors, but they're pretty much up to the president. So if the president decides to remove them or change the agency, or let's say DOGE gets involved and decides to reduce the size of the agency, that's all going to have an effect on everything. It's going to have an effect on where IEEE gets money from. It's going to have an effect on what regulations IEEE is subject to. And if you are, I'm currently studying for my ham radio license. I've gotten my first two levels. I'm studying for the amateur extra right now. And the FCC controls everything pretty much. So then there's the Federal Aviation and Aeronautics, NASA, EPA. And the EPA is what started all this. Back in 2020, everybody was focused on Roe versus Wade. And that was a big thing that the Supreme Court did, whether you agree with it or not, right? But an equally important case involved the Environmental Protection Agency. And that's for the EPA. The EPA had stepped in for a couple who wanted to build a dock on a pond where their house was located. The EPA said the adjoining lands were wetlands. The couple said, you're overstepping your bounds. Your authority is over freshwater lands and fresh water. This isn't that. So they sued. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, you've overstepped your bounds. There's a problem with agencies. They rule our lives, whether you're talking about the Internal Revenue Service, the FCC, Social Security Administration, you name an agency, it affects you. Locally, the Department of Motor Vehicles has a great deal of say of things. And what's the problem with the agencies? Well, nobody elected them. And that's what the Supreme Court looked at. And in 2020, they basically dismantled what the EPA could do. And that led Donald Trump down the path he's taking now to get rid of or reduce the size of agencies and reduce the power agencies have. Part of it is justification. The answer is, people complain, for example, about Elon Musk. One of the frequent complaints is nobody elected him. Well, no one elected the person running the IRS or the FCC or the FAA or NASA. They're all presidential appointments. Now, there are rules to those appointments, but as you can see from Trump's actions so far, he basically decides what rules apply to him, what doesn't. He's in the category of it's better to beg for forgiveness than to ask permission, and he doesn't beg for forgiveness. So a lot of these things that are happening now with the presidency are things that will affect not just IEEE, but everybody. Okay. Let's take a look at the Form 990 from the 2023 tax return for IEEE. You are a 501c3, not-for-profit agency, so you file this Form 990. It showed a total revenue of approximately $650 million. Of that, 3.5 million comes from grants and dues, and a little less than 65.5 million comes from investment income. Do you follow the stock market? Have you watched what's happened to the stock market? If you have a 401k, or in my case, since I was a public employee, a 403b, you know that it's been a roller coaster ride over the last couple of months. It will continue to be. All right. So tariffs, supply chains, the stock market volatility are all affected by POTUS decisions. POTUS is obviously the president of these United States. This means that roughly 11% of IEEE's funds are dependent to some degree on POTUS's actions and pronouncements. And these days, the stock market, if Donald Trump burps, it reacts. So where'd this power come from? Okay, if you look at the Constitution, it has certain things listed, and much of what you see presidents doing ain't there. It's not in the Constitution. So where's it coming from? Now, the members of the Philadelphia Convention, let's go over a little history lesson. I'm sure you learned some of this in high school and have forgotten all about it, right? You know that after the American Revolution, there was a period of time where we had no Constitution. What we had was something called the Articles of Confederation. And it basically was enacted right at the point of the Revolutionary War to allow George Washington to gather an army, for example. And there was a great deal of debt rung up during the Revolutionary War. Washington would go to local farmers, get food. Actually, his people he appointed would do that work. They would get food, clothing, stuff for the soldiers to fight with, and a lot of debt was built up. After the Revolutionary War, people wanted that debt repaid, particularly the farmers. One of them, led by a guy named Shea, started a rebellion. Now, it didn't go much of anywhere, but it showed how powerless the federal government was to do anything about it. There was no mechanism in place for George Washington or anyone else. George Washington wasn't president yet. He had retired back to his farm, was busy making whiskey, but there was no mechanism for the federal government to do anything about that rebellion. Hence the Constitutional Convention, which did not start out that way. Originally, it was started out to be an amendment to the Articles of Confederation. But they locked the doors. They said, nobody's leaving here until we have a completely new form of government. And basically, that's what they did. And the delegates wrestled with things like, all right, we got this idea of a tripartite government. We're going to have a Congress. We've decided after a lot of debate that it should be a bicameral legislation. That is, that there should be people directly responsible to the people. And because Congress didn't really trust the people, they said, we also need bright, intelligent people who are going to be counterbalancing the will of the people, the will of the rabble. Hence the notion of the Senate. Originally, the Senate was appointed by the legislatures of the states. That changed later on, and today, any Tom, Dick, or Harry can run for senator. But in those days, there was a limit on it. So they had the idea of balancing power. All right, we have a judiciary and a president. What do? How do they balance power? Many people had the idea, for example, that if we're going to have somebody who's going to be an executive, that person should just be like the office boy and do what Congress says to tell him to do. So we say, we're going to pass a law, we want you to do this, and the person who's the executive is going to do that, nothing else. Other people said, well, wait a minute, we have some background on this. After the Revolutionary War, many of the states set up governments. They had their own constitutions. New York was one of the first, and New York's constitution turned out to be a blueprint for the federal government. They said the governor of New York can do certain things independently. And you really need someone who can act independently of Congress. Why? Because Congress is a whole bunch of people. And we know how long it takes a whole bunch of people to make a decision on anything. And you guys have all worked with committees, yes? How many times have your committee meetings turned into rabble rousing or free-for-all sessions, you know? If you want a little interesting side note, this happened to Major Roberts in San Francisco, who was a military leader who was asked to lead a church congregation. If you've ever been involved in a church congregation, and I have, you know what a disaster it was. He went tooling around looking for a guidebook on it and wrote one himself. It's today called Robert's Rules of Order, and it's one of the guiding principles of IEEE. You have a provision in your bylaws that says where the bylaws don't address something, Robert's rules will prevail. That's how it came to be written. He was trying to lead a church meeting and couldn't do it. All right, so what is the president to do? It took a lot of wrangling. And even when they voted on the Constitution, even when the members at this convention voted on it, they weren't entirely sure what they were doing. And just imagine yourself. You're a bunch of guys. Here you are. We put you alone in a room. We say, all right, we need you to govern yourselves. What are you going to do? How are you going to start? What would be the logical thing to do? Come on, you're engineers. Do you start by reinventing the wheel every day?
You write some rules?
Well, you ask what's already been done. What's been done in the past? Right?
Yep.
Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So the immediate source of Article 2, which governs the presidency, was the New York Constitution. They said, let's take a look at that. All right. The governor of New York was elected by the people and was independent of the legislature. His term was 3 years, but he could be reelected indefinitely. Right? What else could the governor do? His decisions, except with regard to appointments and vetoes, was unencumbered with a council. He didn't have to ask the legislature for permission to do things. He was in charge of the militia. He was possessed of the pardoning power, and he was charged to take care that the laws were faithfully executed. So many of the people of the Constitutional Convention said, well, our executive should have those same kind of powers. But what does it mean? All right. There was, right up till the day of closing, they weren't sure what they were going to do in that Constitutional Convention. They weren't sure whether there was going to be one president or multiple people serving the role as executive. But they finally arrived at a kind of blend. They said, all right, let's have a person as a president, one person. We'll give him some powers and reserve others for Congress. So that was the solution. However, when they left, if you talk to those 52 delegates to the Constitutional Convention, you would get 52 different answers as to what it all meant. Remember, these were human beings. We look at them and call them founding fathers. They were more like Jeremy's age than our age, Al. So they were more like founding brothers or sons. Most of them were in their 40s or younger. And there were a few older people there. But for the most part, these were people who were flailing around in the dark, asking what has been done before, what should we do? All right, and this blend kind of resulted. All right, let's look at what kind of powers the President of the United States has. One, the President has those explicitly granted by Article 2 of the United States Constitution. We're going to go through those. Then there are acts that are those granted by acts of Congress. So Congress can give the President additional powers. By the way, it can't do the same with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has limited powers, and in fact, the very first case where the Supreme Court declared itself supreme was over the fact that Congress had granted additional powers that weren't in the Constitution. They haven't done that to the president yet. But for example, you've listened to things called executive orders, right? You can scour the Constitution. You will not find mention of executive orders in there anywhere. Then they're not part of it. So we have implied powers and soft powers. Those are the ones that historically presidents or executive people had, governors and so on. And that's a fuzzy, fuzzy area. Right now, Donald Trump is taking full advantage of that. He's pushing, expanding presidential power. But he's not alone. He's not the first guy to have done this. We'll see that throughout our history, we've had presidents who've expanded presidential power and basically gotten away with whatever they could get away with until Congress says, whoa, that's our bailiwick, back off, buddy. That doesn't happen very often. And right now, you've got a Congress and a Supreme Court who think pretty much the way the president does. So even though they should step in, if I were a Republican in Congress, I might say something like, look, I agree with you, Trump. I like what you're doing, but that's our job, not yours. And we're going to follow procedure. But that's not happening right now. And again, this is not the first time in history. All right, let's take a look at Article 2. Let's see what the Constitution says the president can do. And beware of Article 1. Did you see the movie Scrooge with Alistair Sim? I watch it every Christmas Eve. At one point, the ghost of Christmas future is there, and he opens up his robe, and underneath there are two children. And Scrooge says, who are these? He says, the boy is ignorance, the girl is want. Beware them both, but most of all, beware the boy. And we look at the president's power in Article 1. That's the one you should beware. The president shall be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. Now, you may think that's a fairly straightforward statement, right? Let me tell you, there ain't nothing in the Constitution that's straightforward. This is why we have a Supreme Court, and they change their mind every 20 years or so. He may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer at each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices. So what's that all about? That's the president's cabinet, those executive departments. He shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. I like the fact that Donald Trump toyed with pardoning himself at one point. But you can't do it in cases of impeachment. It's directly forbidden by the Constitution. But that may not stop him, and it hasn't stopped other presidents. He shall have the power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. He shall nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and councils, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for and which shall be established by law. Those are all those agencies we're talking about earlier. But the Congress may by law vest the appointment of such inferior officers as they think proper in the president alone, in the courts of law, or in the heads of departments. And that's another expansion of power there. By the way, if you have questions or comments, feel free to chime in.
How
Okay.
close is Now, how
I
much?
wouldn't want to listen to me for an hour alone, so please.
I'm jumping in. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Duncan?
Yes,
Okay.
jump in with any thoughts you got.
Great. So you were mentioning that a lot of this was based on the New York Constitution, right?
Yes. And
How
other,
much, New York, yeah, how much
but,
of the New York Constitution was based on the English Constitution or any
well,
other?
again, Kit, we get to the idea that nobody reinvented the wheel. What
Mhm.
they did was they looked to the past. And in the past, they saw things they liked and things they didn't like. So the structure of our government, a House of Commons and a House of Lords. We have a House of Congressmen, and we have the House and we have the Senate. So the pattern is there. But there were things they didn't like as well. They didn't like the king. Um, they didn't like the idea of an army taking over a government and taking over a country. That's one of the reasons they put the power to command the army in the hands of the president. They wanted a civilian authority. Okay, we're going to get more into that in a little bit. The
Thank you.
president shall have the power to fill up all vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate by granting commissions which shall expire at the end of their next session. So one of the things the president can do is wait till Congress takes a vacation and then appoint people like mad that he wants to have something done with and get them to do something. Okay? He shall from time to time give to the Congress information of the state of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. He may on extraordinary occasions convene both houses or either of them, and in case of disagreement between them with respect to the time of adjournment, he may adjourn them to such time as he shall think proper. He shall receive ambassadors and other public ministers. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed and shall commission all officers of the United States. So that's it. 11 stated powers of the president. And from that, we get all of the other crap that presidents have done. Let's take a look at them one at a time. And we're going to spend most of today on the war power, the commander-in-chief clause. From the evidence available, it appears the framers vested the duty in the president because experience in the Continental Congress had disclosed the expediency of vesting command in a single official. What that means is they like George Washington. They like the job he did. And also they didn't want military taking over the place, as I mentioned earlier. Al, it looked like you had a question there or a comment, but you got to turn your sound on first. It works better that way when you talk.
No, thank you.
Okay. All right. Early cases and commentary emphasize the purely military aspects of the commander-in-chiefship. Alexander Hamilton, for example, said the office would amount to nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military and naval forces as first general and admiral of the Confederacy. Now, that doesn't mean the Confederacy as in the Civil War. That meant the confederation of states that were put together to form the Union. Okay. Now, interesting question. Can the President of the United States get on his white horse and lead soldiers into battle? What do you think? Jeremy, what do you think? We'll put you on the spot.
Seems like it. In
Yeah,
the
there are only
direction of the military, yeah.
two presidents have done it. George Washington, but he didn't go into a war. All right. James Madison did. When the British attacked Washington during the War of 1812, Madison left Washington, D.C., because they were burning down the White House at that point, and assumed command of a small group of artillery. He almost got captured by the British because he decided to charge over a hill where there were 1,000 British soldiers waiting for him. And if it weren't for two lookouts on a bridge he had to cross over stopping him, he probably would have gotten captured by the British. But he did it during a time of war. Washington did it during the Whiskey Rebellion. Do you know what that was? There
No.
was
I
a
think.
tax. There was an unpopular tax on whiskey. So it started a rebellion. Washington, Washington started uh, under an act we're going to talk about. Washington first sent somebody to read them a letter that said disperse. I would not like to have been that public official writing into this mob and saying you must disperse. But that was part of the requirements of the act that gave Washington permission to do this. Washington then gathered about 14,000 people together of the militia and rode into the rebellion. They got so scared, the rebels got so scared they dispersed before Washington even got there. So Washington and Madison are the only two presidents who've ever ridden into battle with the troops. And I'm just picturing Donald Trump on a white horse with an orange mane, of course, leading the troops into battle somewhere. That's an image that's going to burn into my retinas. All right.
Maybe he's gonna go to Canada or
Invade
someplace.
Canada or Greenland. I can see him on
Yeah,
and the head of the white horse now riding in.
yes.
All right.
Bone spurs.
Now, I'm sorry.
Bone spur. It's
But he
bone
has
spur.
bone
Bone
spurs.
spur. Yeah. He won't be doing that himself, yes.
All right. Now, later on, one of the Supreme Court justices by the name of Joseph Story, he wrote on the debates that were accompanying the ratification of the Constitution and on this particular power, and basically said that the president might, but there was no necessity that he should take command in person. And unless the president possessed superior military talents, he probably shouldn't. That was the battle. I could see Trump, though. I'm trying to picture Trump riding into Greenland. You know, a country of 70, what do they have, 70,000 people in Greenland total?
On a snowmobile, maybe.
Some small amount.
Yeah. Maybe he'll ride in on a snowmobile.
No, it's got to be a white Charger, maybe
Okay.
Dodge Charger. All right.
Okay.
All right. John Marshall suggested the president. Now, who's John Marshall? Any of you know? You remember?
Chief Justice, I'm guessing.
No, no, well, you know, as I'm reviewing the amateur radio stuff, I'm realizing how much physics and electricity and electronics I've forgotten. And so you must be the same way with American history.
Yes.
John Marshall was the author of Marbury versus Madison. Does that case ring a bell from your high school days?
Probably, if I
Jeremy?
had a brain. If I had a brain.
Jeremy, you remember hearing that somewhere along the line? Well, you were asleep in history class, right? All right. Don't blame me. I was bored to tears by this stuff when I was in high school. I'm excited by it now, but you know, I'm an old guy. So, all right. So, what was that all about? When John Adams left office, John Adams was the president after Washington, and his vice president was Thomas Jefferson. At first, they were friends, they became bitter rivals. Jefferson was today what we'd call a Republican. Adams was what today we would call a Democrat. And Democrats have always traditionally believed in federal power over state power. Republicans have always felt the other way around, right? So before Adams left office, he had run against Jefferson and lost, so he wasn't reelected. He appointed as many judges as he could. Sound familiar?
Mhm.
You know, let me appoint everybody who's a Federalist that I can find. One of them was this guy, Marbury. And although they weren't called judges, he was called a notary public. In those days, notary publics had judicial power as well, basically like small claims court today, right?
Mhm.
And the problem was he left office and Adams left office, and his Secretary of State filled out all the paperwork, but never gave it to Marbury. So Marbury looked at the Judicial Act of 1789 and said, I'm bringing an action called a writ of mandamus to the Supreme Court. A writ of mandamus is an action that tells a person legally obliged to do something that he's got to do it, right? In this case, that the Secretary of State has to give him his commission as a notary public. Now, John Marshall was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He had a real dilemma. The dilemma was that if he found in Marbury's favor Thomas Jefferson was liable to say, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, go pound rice. I'm not doing it." After all, what the Supreme Court doesn't have is a police force or an army. Well, that's not quite true. They have a small police force inside their building, but outside they have nothing to enforce whatever decision they make. And this is true throughout government. Government relies in part on the cooperation between the branches of government, just as the criminal justice system depends in large measure on the cooperation of the criminal. Al, you may be old enough to remember. I don't know how old you are, Al. I think you're younger than I am, but you may remember a group called the Chicago Seven. You remember them?
Yes, I
They
do.
disrupted the Democratic National Convention. Yeah, the judge didn't know what to do with them. They kept disrupting the judicial proceedings. Finally, he had them bound and gagged. Well, today we have less drastic measures. But if the government chooses not to cooperate with each other, all havoc breaks loose. All right. So here we
And a
had
writ of
here we had
mandamus doesn't help. Does a writ of mandamus make the government do what they're supposed to do or not?
well, the writ of mandamus brought before the Supreme Court, if granted, and Marshall decided that it should be granted, then it would require the Secretary of State to transmit to this guy his commission as a notary public. But Marshall was smart enough to know that if he demanded it, Jefferson was liable to say no, basically ruining whatever authority the Supreme Court had. So he did the greatest political two-step in history. Right? He looked at the law and he said, you know, under this law, all right, this guy did everything right. He deserves his commission. The Secretary of State had signed it, sealed it. The only failure was in delivering the commission. He should be entitled to it. But the law which gave Marbury the right to bring the action of mandamus is unconstitutional because it expands the power of the Supreme Court beyond what the Constitution says, and therefore his action is dismissed. So he kept everybody happy, except for Marbury, who never got his thing. And it is known as the case that established the supremacy of the Supreme Court and its right to declare acts of Congress unconstitutional. That was not exercised again until 50 years later. And that was in the Dred Scott decision. Does that name ring a bell from your high
Oh,
school
yeah.
day?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Dred Scott was a slave who claimed he was free because he had gone to a free zone, and under the Missouri Compromise, that meant he was a free man. And Roger Taney, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, looked at that and said, yep, according to that law, you should be a free man. But that law is also unconstitutional, and you are therefore nothing more than chattel, that is property, and you're going to be returned to your owner. Dred Scott eventually did become a free man and did eventually buy back his wife and children. So he eventually got it. So wandering far afield. So what Marshall said was, they had a case in front of him where during the war with France, we had hostilities with France, not war, but Congress had said that U.S. ships could capture any ship headed into France. And what happened was the president had authorized the seizure of a ship that was heading from France. And what Marshall said was, nope, you've gone beyond your presidential authority. You can't act beyond what Congress gives you in this regard, even though because there's no declared war, among other things. All right, so Taney, before he wrote the Dred Scott decision, actually seemed to be a pretty good judge. And prior to Dred Scott, he once defended an abolitionist. So it's an interesting story as to how Taney came to write Dred Scott, which has been declared as one of the worst decisions the Supreme Court ever made. But it was a time of crisis in his life. Let's just leave it at that. So what Taney said was the duties are purely military. He has no right to deal with anything on our land except in time of war. And even during time of war, it doesn't give the president the right to expand the boundaries of the United States. That's something only Congress can do through its treaty power. This was at a time when the United States had declared war against Mexico. And that resulted in a terrible thing for the Mexicans living in the Western United States. There was a treaty called Guadalupe Hidalgo, which basically said Mexicans living there. And let me let you understand something. Most of what we now call the United States was Mexico at one time. Pretty much everything west of the Mississippi River, with a few exceptions, was declared as Mexico. And that treaty said that Mexicans living there could gain American citizenship and could retain their land. Neither one happened. Their land was taken from them, and they were denied American citizenship and basically deported to Mexico. So Trump's not the first person to deport Mexicans. All right. And it was large scale, too. Now, the commander-in-chief clause has been used as a justification for a wide range of presidential excesses. For example, Harry Truman, in the steel seizure cases, we were in the middle of the Korean War. There was a strike at the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company. We needed the sheet metal for the military. So Truman went in and took over the company. He said to the striking workers, you will go back to work or you will go to jail. Went to the Supreme Court, and the court said, no, you can't do that. It has nothing to do with an army or navy. You're not leading them into battle. And even though there may be a police action going on, because the Korean War wasn't actually a declared war, much like Vietnam, you don't have the right to do that. But Trump holds a very expansive view similar to that. Okay. Now, the clause has two separate and related purposes. First was in response to the charge of the Declaration of Independence that the king had affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. In other words, when before the revolution, the king could declare the military could do anything. It also explains another provision in the U.S. Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, that has never been the subject of a Supreme Court case. And that's the Third Amendment. Anybody know what that amendment says?
No.
Never even heard of it, right? You've heard of the First Amendment, freedom of speech, press, right of assembly, Second Amendment, gun rights. Nobody's heard of the Third Amendment.
Where is my pocket constitution when I need it?
The Third Amendment says that the military cannot quarter troops in private houses
Oh,
except
yeah,
in time of war, according to rules established by Congress. And yet, since then, no troops have ever been quartered in civilian houses, although there was a rumor that in World War II, some civilians offered their houses to some of the local generals to house troops, but the generals reportedly declined. There's no authentication for that story, so we have no citation for it. But as far as we know, that's never happened, and it's the one portion of the United States Constitution which has never been litigated in the Supreme Court. Let's hope it stays that way. Am I boring you to death yet?
No, not yet.
All right.
We have
Jeremy?
questions. We have questions.
Jeremy, you still awake there? All right. Who had a question? Kit?
I was wondering about the so I read that there was another presidential, whatever you were saying earlier when you were talking today or yesterday, where local police are now going to be armed like military, and that it's like essentially.
Well, that's actually been a growing concern. One of the things local police forces started doing was buying surplus military equipment. And we're going to get to the Posse Comitatus Act, which is what you're talking about, which basically restricts the military from operating on U.S. soil. But there are ways of getting around it, and Donald Trump is an expert at it. For example, consider the latest move. You want to have military arresting people crossing the border illegally? Simple. You declare the area around the border as a military zone. Then the military can act. They can't declare it as a military base exactly, because that would involve condemnation of private property in order to make it a base. But he can
Mhm.
declare it a military zone. And what's a military zone? Whatever the president declares it to be, until somebody says no. And no one has said no so far.
Who is it that has the right to say no?
Who has the right to say no? Well, if you're an illegal immigrant, you don't have any rights. So you can't be the one to complain. If you are one of the private property owners along the border, theoretically you have standing to complain, because now they're on your property and claiming it's a military zone. Does the president have the right to do this? Only when one of those private property owners takes the case to the Supreme Court will we have an answer. And
Okay.
so far that hasn't happened. I mean, just
Right,
because
again, because of the Third Amendment, right?
well, not the Third Amendment, that involves quartering troops in houses. But they would argue that in effect, you're condemning my property without due process.
But a lot of that
Okay.
property that is subject to that was state owned.
Well, if it's state-owned, then the state governor has the right. The problem is most of those property orders and governors agree with Trump. So they're not complaining. And they're pretty much the only ones have standing to do that.
Well, New Mexico is not Republican governed.
Uh, well, so far, nobody's complained. Nobody's made the argument or launched the lawsuit, not to my knowledge. And that's the only way that'll be resolved. You
It
can
happened
only-
2 days ago. It's a little early for a
Yeah.
suit to
And it
be.
takes time to get to the Supreme Court. There's probably no emergency authority that can be enacted unless it involves somebody's land who seriously can't use his land because of it. So it's an interesting concept. Does it violate posse comitatus? Maybe. It will take the Supreme Court to decide. And they're starting to give a little pushback to Trump, as you notice. They've said no to him on more than one occasion. And he's not happy with that. But they've said yes a lot too. So, all right.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
Not, one second, yeah. The question I have is that how, in other words, right now, the party loyalty is actually trumping over the Constitution. It seems like, in other words, the Congress is not acting in a responsible manner where they should. And the courts sometimes seem to be just, based on, the way they vote in Supreme Court even, it seems to be along the party loyalty as opposed more than actually what the function is.
Oh,
Is there
there's no question. We have not had a functioning federal government for some time. Everything is determined along party lines without any question. And
So there's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about parties. And is there any way this whole party system can be abolished or something, some other way things can happen? Because otherwise it's going to be more dysfunctional than what it is right now.
right. Well, George Washington did warn us against political parties. That was in his farewell speech, just as Dwight Eisenhower warned against the military-industrial complex. And both those warnings have proven to be good warnings. What can be done about it? The only tool we've got, since we don't have the right of recall under our Constitution, like some other countries do, in Canada and England, they can recall their elected leaders by have vote of no confidence. We don't have that option. All we have is the election cycle. Congressmen are elected for 2 years. That means they're constantly running, constantly pandering to their base. And they're going to pander to the people who vote. So realize in this country, there are many people who complain about things who never show up at the polls.
Yes.
And those elected officials know that. So when they're planning their political campaigns, the first thing they look to is the registered voter polls, the registered voters in the area. It shows who voted in the last election. It doesn't show how they voted, but if you're in a district like I am in Rockland County, where Democrats outnumber us 3-1, outnumber Republicans 3-1, all you do is look at the Democrat voting record to see that well over half the Democrats never vote. So they're out there picketing, carrying signs, but they're not going to the polls. And that really is the only remedy we've got. You elect someone else, and then you got to elect someone with a spine, someone who doesn't want to be reelected, basically. You get them in office and say, I want you not to pay attention to the party bosses, but to do what's right for us. And here's what we want. Hey, Tom, how you doing?
I think the reason it's worse right now, at least that's what it seems, is that this has now become a place where the corruption is there's always corruption at a one level, but this corruption is overt and obvious the way things are done, and this will sink the country if something is not done to fix this. I don't know how far people have to suffer before they're going to vote all these people out completely 100%, because it's really ruining the whole system.
We don't seem to want to fix the system, really. I mean, you can ask what the American people want by asking what happens. You can say, wanting is expressed by the actions. And the actions so far have been pendulum swings. First, we get a government that leans toward liberalism. Then we get a government that leans towards conservatism. It goes back and forth. And the Congress that you're seeing today is dysfunctional, but it's not the only Congress that has been dysfunctional. This has happened since this country was formed. So it's nothing new. George Washington, go ahead, Al.
Is there any precedent for the sort of circumstance where the legislators fear for their lives if they disagree with the executive? The way many of the Republican Party seem to say, well, we can't disagree with him. He'll send the goons after us.
Well, yes, there is precedent, not quite the same, but there have been fist fights in Congress. There have been people hit with canes in Congress. There have been duels that resulted from things said in Congress. So, yeah, again, this kind of action or inaction is nothing new. It's part of the penalty of being a democracy. If you're a democracy and you're going to have the will of the people, and we choose to be a Republican democracy where people elect a representative, you're going to have people who want to get reelected. You're going to have people who think, I've got to have other people around me who think like I do, and I'm going to gather them together, and we're going to vote together, because that's the way we'll retain power. Now, come on, you work in organizations. You must have observed that organizations tend to try to grab all the power they can and all the resources they can. In any organization, you're going to have different departments, and each one is going to be self-aggrandizing. Each department is going to want to bolster itself up, even at the expense of other departments. That's true of the federal government, too, and the state government. It's a human foible.
It
All
seems
the-
also, though, that when there's a leader, like whether it's just, for example, the president of the United States, when I say just, I don't mean to minimize that position. I'm just saying one person whose will or authority has subsumed all the other authorities. How does one reason with that? How does one deal with that? Because
get
like
out
you
of it.
said,
The
yeah.
last president who assumed this much authority and who abused the war powers so much was Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
And everybody liked him, right? Pretty much.
Well, not everybody liked him. There were people who did not like him, but he was so well liked that, again, right now we've got people in Congress doing whatever the president says, a good deal of it out of fear. If nothing else, fear they wouldn't get reelected, that he would have campaigns against them. He
Then
would
there's also the fear that was just
Right.
mentioned, which is the violence, fear of violence, right?
Right. And what we're seeing is not something that hasn't happened before. It's the extent, the magnitude of what's happened. That's
Do you think
what-
that's a social
what-
media phenomenon or modern communication style or the number
Well,
of people or
we
what?
have more modes of communication now, and we have more ways of causing people to be biased. And a politician takes advantage of that. He knows, we've always liked sound bites. We've always liked our problems in nice, simple packages. And somebody who offers it, now, I don't want to say that Trump is Adolf Hitler, but he certainly could have learned from Hitler's lessons. Look at what Hitler did. He would keep people waiting in crowds for hours at a time, standing around waiting, and then finally show up. They were hungry, thirsty, they wanted to go. Of course, they were glad to see him. It meant they were going to get to leave. And he took advantage of that. He took advantage of the fact that German people in particular were inured to obeying people in uniform, obeying people who looked official, following signs and doing what it said without questioning. That's how they were raised. Hitler took advantage of that. Trump knows how to control media. Look what he's doing in the White House press corps. If you don't agree with me on some things, you're not going to be in here anymore.
I
And he
think
claimed-
one more thing that I'm seeing is that there is a mafia style approach of using, I don't know, I'm just guessing, using FBI and other resources to go and dig dirt on a whole bunch of lawmakers and all. Everybody has some skeleton or something like that. I mean, there's no way to find out, but the thing is, no one is pure. And then that is one more way in which you can control the various branches of the government.
And
to
you know who
the-
was an expert at that before the present government? Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover served many presidents, but more often it was said that many presidents served Herbert Hoover, head of the FBI. He had a file on everybody. I'm pretty sure there's a file on me somewhere too. So,
Certainly your family.
yeah, and what's happening in the United States right now is happening worldwide. There's a definite shift toward authoritarian government right now and toward single person power. Take Putin in Russia, for example, or Kim, what's his name in North Korea. Take what's going on in India and Pakistan. So all over the world, there's been a shift toward the right, toward conservatism, toward insulating your country, and as Hitler did, it's easy to scapegoat. What's our scapegoat in the United States? Well, for Hitler, it was Jews, right? For the United States, it's immigrants of any sort, and they become the people that every country is against right now. And there are a lot of people running around thinking if only all these immigrants weren't here, our lives would be better. Well, that's exactly the kind of argument Hitler used. And it worked for him, for at least for a couple of years before he and his wife committed suicide. So, what can be done about it? The only real thing that we have in our constitutional arsenal is the power of the vote. And if you complain and don't vote, nothing's going to change. There's no
Did everybody
guarantee
get
that if you
their-
do vote, it will. But I'm sorry, Kit.
Did everyone get their ballot who lives in New Jersey? I got mine today. Did everyone get their ballot in the mail today? No?
ballot, I don't, yes.
Good. Excellent. Okay. Just checking. Okay,
So-
sorry. Dan.
So TK, I'm sorry to tell you that the only way things are going to change is if you get out and vote, and you vote for someone who's actually going to defy party politics. That person is called the loser in the next election after that.
Right.
That person will never get reelected.
Yeah, I always vote every time, and so if I'm at least do it over the mail, one way or the other, I get that done. But you're right; it's hard to find. Sometimes you don't have a good pick, and that's part of the problem. But what I find really the most destructive thing happening is this idea of a party, and the party then takes over, and it takes a life of its own.
It
And if
does.
there's some way to neutralize that idea of a party completely, like each person has to run on their own, I think it may be different.
Well, it would be. The problem is, again, you've been to meetings with people in IEEE. How often can you get a group of 100 people, let's say, to agree on anything? How about what to eat for the meal? You know, what should be served? What the topic of discussion should be? Who should be the leader? You know, what you see in IEEE is a microcosm of what we see in the federal government.
And the IEEE has more documents ruling it, right, than the government, you said, correct?
Yeah, you do. I looked at your bylaws. I said, your bylaws are about 200 times longer than the US Constitution. And I defy you to find one member who understands them, except for maybe the lawyer who works with the bylaws all the time. So,
It's
all
even
right.
self-contradictory. I don't think all of these are all consistent across the board, because there's a lot of local laws that are permitted and they are actually contradictory to other. But who's going to go and challenge? And somebody has to read all of this completely to understand, and then have to start. So no one knows what to do. It's like, so information is power here. So if somebody else, what's
Well,
written there, you can do
you're
something.
hitting on it, TK. I mean, for one thing, I understand that up until about the mid 1700s, it was possible for one person to read every book that ever been printed. Today, with the information available in the world, it is impossible for one human being to assimilate even a small portion of that. So, but getting back to the political problem, TK, when are you running for office? TK?
No, that's fine. I've done, I'll support the right causes and not don't want to be affiliated with parties, but certainly I've always supported for the right cause. So that's the
Okay.
extent to which I'm going to do.
Well, let me ask you this, TK. Do you
Yeah.
think Donald Trump thinks that he's on the wrong side of history?
I think he's not even thinking about history, because he's unique in the sense that he's interested in only two things, it seems to me. One is how to amass more power and how to amass more wealth. And anyway, he is able to see one way or the other to make a deal which will benefit him personally. So
Right.
this time around, there's much more interest in saying, okay, this meme coin and this and that, and getting out of jail before. And now they're even planning on how to avoid a impeachment in case later on, not now, none of the Congress people will ever do that, but in case they lose the Congress, how they do. There are some people doing all this kind of planning. So he surrounded himself with a bunch of people who are ready to say yes to whatever he says.
Mm-hmm.
But he's also, the problem is that, being that he's close to 80, and he's got some cognitive issues, and he's got some physical issues, very significant physical issues. So those are the ones that are going to come in his way right now, because it's
Right.
even
Well,
though
maybe he thinks he's going to live forever if he pronounces it. But again, TK, this is not the first time this has happened in this country. We're going to look at other examples, although we can't look at them today. We only have another 2 minutes before we're going to end the session. But I'm doing 3 sessions for Kit. So if I haven't depressed you enough with this session, please come back next Tuesday, and the Tuesday after we'll continue. Do you have any questions before we go, though? Any issues? TK, you got to run for office, buddy.
Oh, thank you.
Lena,
Maybe
do you want to say hello? And I don't know who is Bao Hua. Bao Hua? Do we know Bao Hua?
No, I see TK. I see Tom and Jeremy there.
And Lena is here too. Lena, I asked Lena to join us tonight. She's one of our teachers, and I told her that she had to come tonight to meet my teacher, Dr. Lee. So here she's
Well,
here.
listen, guys, it's been fun. I hope you're
Mhm.
not too frustrated. And if you like tonight or want to hear more and be your glutton for punishment, I'll be back here next week, same time, same bat channel.
wonderful
Yes.
session, really, really
So
super
we'll look
session.
for it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to turn off the recording now. If I can do, Tom, can you figure out how to turn off the recording?
All right.